Hello Booktube, welcome back to another video. Today I want to talk about what I like in Jane Austen in honor celebration of Jane Austen July. I have actually been reading through the Jane Austen canon this year, and I didn't really start off the year with that intention, but it just kind of developed somewhere along the lines. I first read Sense and Sensibility, then I read or listened to Pride and Prejudice, and then I read or rather listened to Emma, and then I read Mansfield Park in July, which was the group read for Jane Austen July. And I talked about Mansfield Park quite a bit in a recent video. And some of what I have to say may kind of just retread some of that video, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experience reading Jane Austen the last few months and just some things I've noticed. I also recently finished reading a book that was recommended by Katie Lumsden at Books and Things as a part of Jane Austen July, which is called What's Important About Jane Austen, or What's Important in Jane Austen. I think it's the title of it by an author named John Mullan. And kind of the subtitle to it was like 20 questions or 20 issues sort of raised in Jane Austen's books. And so he goes through 20 different kind of elements of Jane Austen's writing and stories and context and whatnot. So just finished that, and that was pretty helpful in terms of understanding some of the things that she was writing about. And one of the last chapters dealt with Jane Austen's role of making love stories, or to the extent to which her books are love stories. Or now let me back up. It's a chapter about marriage proposals, I think, is what it is, and what makes a good marriage proposal and what doesn't. But in relation to that, it's a chapter that deals with how Jane Austen writes about romance and love. And what has struck me in the books I've read, the 4 books I've read, I still haven't read Northanger Abbey, and I just started Persuasion. So, everything I say needs to be sort of caveated with that. And I haven't read Lady Susan, her short story, her novella, I guess it was. But what's interesting to me, one thing that's interesting to me is Jane Austen is sort of, I think, widely regarded as a romance novelist, as that what she wrote was love stories. And, I have to, what's been interesting about her is I haven't really found her books to be what I would consider conventional love stories. And admittedly, the reason for that has to do with the era and the norms and the kind of the social mores of the time and place and class in which Jane Austen wrote. So on the one hand, yeah, it's not like her books are about a romance between a man and woman that is sort of the central part of the book, and then the rest of the narrative is just sort of little pieces that are just sort of hung on just to sort of give context to it. To me, her writings feel much more like they're stories about family and home and society and life. And obviously, romance and love are feature elements of her story, but I don't ever really feel bogged down in the romance of the stories. And I think Katie Lumsden at Books and Things, again, one of her videos, might be a few years old, but one of her videos I watched recently, she kind of classified, I think she said, Persuasion, Emma, and Pride and Prejudice were her books that were Jane Austen's books that were more kind of essentially love stories, and the others are not. I might have the three wrong, but of the four I've read, I think Pride and Prejudice is probably the book that seems to me is most like what I would think of as a romance, in which the introduction of the man and the woman towards the beginning of the story and the love interest kind of plays itself out through the whole book. In a couple of her other books, the characters may know each other, but like in the case of Mansfield Park with Fanny Price and Edmund, there's no assumption of there being a love interest, and when they first meet, they're children, or at least Fanny's a child, and their romance doesn't really. We have Fanny Price's feelings towards Edmund, but in terms of a romantic relationship, that relationship never comes to fruition until the very end of the book. And the book Emma is pretty much like the same thing. The character Emma is trying to arrange romantic connections between various characters, but she herself isn't interested in being married, or that's what her character says. And the relationship the man she ends up marrying, their relationship is never really given any meat until the very end. So it's like there's stories that feature love and romance, but the main characters are not necessarily, the main storyline is not necessarily the love story or the pursuit of romance between two characters. In Sense and Sensibility, again, there is kind of some unrequited love on the part of Eleanor for a man named Edward, but the character of Edward is not really fleshed out very much. Again, not until like really the very end do we really get to see more of who he is, and it isn't until the very end where that relationship sort of comes into being. Most of that story is about family and the sisters, Eleanor and Marianne or Marietta, I forget which. And even though the younger sister is, she is interested in another young man, that relationship doesn't work out. And, so that isn't a relationship that is successfully tracked like through the whole book. So I don't know what I'm really trying to say, but I just think that her writings kind of transcend really the romance, what I would think of as a romance genre style of literature, even though, again, her stories do contain lots of elements of love and attraction and romance, but they're all handled. They're never really they're not the only sort of plot of the story. I think in many of these stories, a couple of them, like with Emma, if you didn't end up putting Emma with the man she marries, I'm not sure that really changes the story a lot. She could marry someone else or the story could come to some other conclusion. And the same with Sense and Sensibility, although I think the way Jane Austen wraps up those stories is very effective. And that's probably one of my favorite things about her writings and the books I've read, is I think she does endings really well. Her endings always leave me feeling something. And, like when I put the book down, I feel like I have entered into the characters and into the story, and I'm left with something almost like I'm still there in that time and place, and I can sort of see these characters as they go on to live their lives in the places that they do. And So I think that's one of the things that's most effective about her writings, and not that her endings are all happy endings, although most of them are for some characters. There are some characters that don't have very happy endings at all. Again, like in Mansfield Park, with Mariah Bertram, uh, and and her aunt, Mrs. Norris. But I think for the main characters, there are happy endings that don't feel like they're contrived or anything. They feel, to me, they work. Even the end where with Fanny Price and Edmund, that I think some people might feel is a little, like we never really see Edmund's love for Fanny Price demonstrated in a romantic sense, and he never thinks of her as a romantic possibility until like the last few last few pages of the book. But still, I feel like it works, and I have not so far felt disappointed in any of the endings with the main characters. Like, I haven't felt like it was superfluous or contrived, or just the endings have all felt like they've worked, and they've all been very satisfying. Again, with slight exception for Mansfield Park, where there is a rather abrupt ending, and kind of some of the most interesting things that happen right at the end, and they're kind of happening off stage. So I think that was only the only one of the 4 books I've read so far where I thought the ending was but I still liked it. And so there's that. And in terms of comparing the 4 books or ranking the 4 Jane Austen books I've read so far, I would say I think I've liked them. My ranking of them has been in the order that I've read or listened to them. So I think my least favorite is Mansfield Park, which was the last one I read. And the third best that I've read so far would be Emma. The second best would be Pride and Prejudice, which I've read second. And then my favorite book so far of hers is the one I read first, which was Sense and Sensibility. But I mean, I think I would put Sense and Sensibility a little further above Pride and Prejudice, and I would put Pride and Prejudice and Emma and Mansfield Park a little closer together. But I've been still kind of reflecting about that, like what did I like or dislike about each book. And with Mansfield Park, I ended up liking the overall arc of the story, and I liked the kind of rural pastoral feel to it. It was very homey. So the overall story ended up working pretty well for me, but I really struggled with some sections of the book that I just didn't enjoy nearly as much, and some of the characters I didn't care for. I think with Emma, in some way, the story itself was maybe not quite as satisfying as Mansfield Park, but I think I enjoyed listening to it, or reading it via audio. I think I enjoyed that. I think I enjoyed that experience more. It was funnier. There was more humor in it. I liked Emma. I know Emma is a complicated, not necessarily immediately likable character, but she does grow and she does learn. And I did enjoy being in her head. And I think of the 4 books I've read of hers, the Emma character is the one that I think John Mullan talks about this in his book, that Emma is really the only book in which Jane Austen is really only telling the story from Emma's point of view, whereas her other novels, Jane Austen's other novels, we get a little more. I mean, there might be a protagonist, but there are sort of supporting actors, we might say, who whose thoughts we get to enter into. And I think that's not quite, I think Emma is the book that's least like that. I mean, almost everything we get in the story is filtered through Emma's own sort of self narration and what's going on in her head. But overall, I enjoyed it quite a lot, and I liked most of all the characters. I mean, I guess kind of the only really not likable character is Mrs. Elton and perhaps, Reverend Elton. But I didn't have a real strong dislike to them. So, there weren't any characters in the book I don't think there were any characters in the book that I didn't like. I was even kind of sympathetic to Emma's father, who's kind of an invalid and a hypochondriac, and I still found him kind of interesting and fun and sympathetic. With Pride and Prejudice, which we're reading for Randy Ray's Seriously Well-Read Book Club, I listened to that a month or two ago, and we're talking about that book over on Randy's Boxer account, and that's been a lot of fun. And I was just, on his channel, I was saying, I think what I really liked about Pride and Prejudice was the Bennett family. They were a lot of fun. I liked Mr. Bennett. I mean, I liked Mrs. Bennett. I liked the Bennett daughters. I just thought they were a lot of fun, and I just kind of got a real kick out of Mr. Bennett in particular, but really liked Jane and Elizabeth. I still have kind of a bad reaction to Darcy when he comes on the stage. I was watching another booktuber who referred to Darcy as kind of like, at least at the beginning, kind of like a butthead, and he is, and I mean, he does grow too, but for a good portion of the book, he is not a likable character, and I don't know that I love the love story between Lizzie and Darcy, but I did like the story, and I was surprised. I'm not sure pleasantly surprised or how I felt about it. I think Pride and Prejudice has such a place in literary and movie and cult. It's so much a part of our culture. It's kind of a hard book to judge in some ways. But what was surprising to me was there is a part at the end with what happens to the sister Lydia, and that I hadn't remembered from my first read, and didn't remember from any of the adaptations. Although I don't know when the last time I really saw a Pride and Prejudice adaptation. But there was kind of a twist at the end of the book. But in many ways, it was a fun read, and I enjoyed the interactions of the characters. But Sense and Sensibility still remains, I think, my favorite. And part of the reason, and here's the other issue with kind of trying and how I'm thinking about each of her books and ranking them. I read Sense and Sensibility and Mansfield Park, but I listened to Pride and Prejudice and Emma. And I chose to listen to Pride and Prejudice and Emma because I think I was more familiar with those stories, so that listening to it, I wouldn't lose too much. And because I do listen to a lot of audiobooks, it just felt natural to listen to those. And they are narrated very well. But even so, I do think I lost a little bit. There were some nuances I missed. And so I think kind of my ranking of the Jane Austen books is sort of the fact that I listened to two and have read two, that affects how I appreciate and understand a book. And so I read Sense and Sensibility, and I read Mansfield Park. And I'm glad I read Mansfield Park because there definitely were some things that if I was just listening to it on audio, I would have missed. I mean, when I was reading the text, I found myself in a few places, I would read something and then as I kept reading, I found myself a little confused. Like, wait a minute, who's talking to who and who is saying what about who? And I had to go back and reread sections and so it took a little bit of that for me to understand what was going on in the story. So anyway, so I think that was important. And so I do intend to go back and reread Emma and Pride and Prejudice at some point. But I am reading Persuasion, and I started to read Northanger Abbey, but I just didn't take to it right away. And so set that aside and picked up Persuasion and a few chapters into Persuasion, and I think I'm kind of liking it so far, and I'm interested to see where it goes. I think I know in a very broad sense what happens, but a lot of the details and relationships that go into that I'm not familiar with at all. So yeah, so I hope to finish reading Persuasion in the next month or two, and then reading Northanger Abbey in the fall, and then I would have all 6 of her major works done this year. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon with another video. Take care. Bye.